She won 2 Academy Awards. She stood in front of the entire world and delivered performances that broke people open. She made millions of strangers feel seen, feel safe, feel understood. And every single night, when the cameras stopped rolling, when the applause faded and the lights went dark, she went home to a secret so devastating that it took her 70 years to finally say it out loud. What if I told you that the woman America considered one of the greatest actresses who ever lived had been living a double life, not one built on scandal or deception, but one built on survival? What if the warmth you felt every time you watched her on screen was not a performance at all, but the only language she had ever found to express the inexpressible? What if the most celebrated smile in Hollywood belonged to a little girl who had never once felt safe in her own home? What if the hunger you saw in her eyes when she said those 4 words that the world turned into a punchline was not insecurity, but something far older and far more devastating than anyone in that auditorium that night could possibly have understood? This is not a story about fame. This is not a story about awards or box office numbers or the machinery of celebrity. This is the story of what it costs to build something magnificent on a foundation of unbearable damage. This is the story of a wound so deep and so carefully hidden that it traveled through 6 decades of living, through 2 Oscars, through 3 marriages, through 3 sons, through a career that rewrote the rules of what women on screen were allowed to be. It traveled all of that distance, and it never once stopped asking the same question. Are you worth it? Not the performance. Not the character. You. Before this video is over, you are going to understand something about Sally Field that the interviews never told you, that the profiles never reached, that the applause always drowned out. And once you understand it, you are never going to be able to watch a single one of her performances the same way again. Stay with me, because this is the story she almost never told. The house in Pasadena looked like the beginning of something wonderful. Sunlight came through wide windows. There was a mother of genuine beauty whose face had appeared on movie screens. And there was a stepfather whose name carried the particular gravity that Hollywood confers on men who look like they were carved from something permanent. From the outside, looking in, the life of young Sally Field had the texture of a gift. The kind of origin story that journalists would one day reach for when they needed to explain how a girl from Pasadena became one of the most celebrated actresses in American history. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Margaret Field, Sally's mother, was a woman of fragile circumstances and real talent. She had worked as an actress, carried herself with the kind of grace that the industry both rewarded and slowly consumed. She had raised her daughter in the shifting, uncertain atmosphere of a household where security was always conditional, where the ground beneath your feet was never quite solid enough to trust. When Margaret married Jock Mahoney, it appeared to those watching from a comfortable distance like a resolution, a stabilizing force, a strong man arriving to anchor a family that needed anchoring. Jock Mahoney was 6 foot 4 inches of physical authority, a former Marine, a celebrated stuntman, a man who would go on to play Tarzan on screen, the archetypal protector, the figure of heroic strength, the embodiment of everything a child is taught to believe a guardian should be. Sally was 4 years old when he entered her life. She was 14 when the abuse finally stopped. 10 years. A full decade of a childhood consumed by what the man her mother had chosen was doing behind the closed doors of a home that looked from every outside angle like safety itself. She would write about it decades later with a precision that is almost unbearable. Not sensationalized, not softened, rendered with the clear-eyed honesty of a woman who had spent years learning how to look directly at something she had spent even more years trying not to see. She did not have language for it as a child. Most children do not. What they have instead is the body's mute testimony, the way the nervous system learns to brace, the way trust curdles into something unrecognizable. The way a little girl begins to understand, without anyone ever saying it plainly, that her safety is not guaranteed. That the people who are supposed to protect her may be the very source of the danger. That love and harm can occupy the same space, wear the same face, speak in the same voice. And that knowledge, absorbed before a child has the architecture to process it, does not stay in childhood. It travels. It shapeshifts. It shows up decades later in the way a woman relates to her own worth. In the patterns she finds herself repeating in relationships she cannot quite explain. In the hunger for approval that no amount of applause ever fully satisfies. The child grows up, but the lesson installed inside her does not age. It simply waits. And there is a particular cruelty layered beneath the abuse itself, one that Sally would not fully articulate until she was in her 70s, until her mother was gone and the silence that had protected everyone else for so long had finally become intolerable. Her mother knew, not in the distant, deniable way that allows people to tell themselves they simply missed the signs. Margaret Field, in the final chapter of her life, told her daughter the truth. She had known. She had seen. And she had made the choice, the devastating and irreversible choice that so many women in her position made in that era, in that industry, in a world that offered them very little power and even less protection. She had stayed. She had been silent. She had chosen, in whatever calculus of fear and dependence and love she was working with, to protect the structure of the household rather than the safety of her child. There are no easy sentences to write about that revelation. There are no clean frameworks for what it means to learn as an adult that the one person who should have been your absolute defender was aware of your destruction and remained in the room anyway. It does not erase the love. It does not cancel the complicated and profound bond that Sally carried for her mother throughout her entire life. A bond so layered that it became the emotional core of her memoir. But it adds a weight to the story that cannot be minimized. A weight that Sally carried alone inside the performances, inside the marriages, inside every moment of public warmth that the world received as simply the natural gift of a naturally warm woman. It was not natural. It was chosen. Every single day. Because here is what Sally Field did with the ruins of her early childhood. She built herself anyway. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not in any way that anyone would describe as clean or linear or resolved. But she built it with the particular ferocity of someone who has been told by circumstances, not by words, that she does not deserve to take up space, and who decides somewhere deep in the marrow to take it up anyway. She discovered acting as a teenager, and acting gave her something the house had never provided. A container for emotion that was otherwise unspeakable. A stage where the chaos inside could be shaped into something that other people could recognize and receive. When she performed, the feeling was not escape exactly. It was more like translation. She was finding a language for experiences that had no other available form. She studied. She worked. She pursued the craft with an intensity that her instructors noticed, and her peers sometimes found unnerving. This was not a woman gliding towards stardom on charm and circumstance. This was a woman building a structure that could hold her weight because she had learned very early that nothing else would. Her first significant television role arrived in 1965 with Gidget, a cheerful sun-drenched comedy about a teenage surfer girl, as far from the interior landscape of Sally's actual experience as it is possible to imagine. She played the role with genuine brightness, with a fizzing comedic energy that delighted audiences and established her in the industry's collective imagination as exactly the kind of wholesome, accessible, relatable young woman that 1960s American television was designed to produce. The Flying Nun followed. More brightness, more accessibility, more of the particular kind of warmth that cameras love and industries exploit without ever asking what fuels it. And beneath all of it, beneath the laugh and the lightness and the girl next door that everyone felt they knew, was a young woman who had never been protected by anyone, learning to protect herself through the only tool she had fully mastered, becoming whoever the room needed her to be. She was 21 years old when she married Stephen Craig in 1968. Young, as people were young then, not just in years, but in the particular unexamined way of someone who has never had the luxury of understanding their own wounds before stepping into the architecture of a shared life. 2 sons arrived, Peter and Eli. The marriage carried within it all the pressures that early marriages carry, amplified by the distortions of an industry that treats personal life as raw material and offers young women, in particular, very little room to grow into themselves before demanding they perform a finished version of who they are. The marriage ended in 1973. She would marry again, Alan Greisman, in 1984. A relationship that produced her 3rd son Samuel and lasted a decade before it too dissolved in 1994. Between and around those 2 marriages lived the relationship that the tabloids treated as entertainment and that Sally herself has spoken about with a complexity the tabloids could never accommodate. Burt Reynolds. For 4 years from the late 1970s into the early 1980s, they were among the most photographed couples in America. On screen they had genuine chemistry, the kind that reads as effortless because it is built on something real. Off-screen, the reality was significantly more turbulent. Reynolds, for all his magnetism and for all the genuine feeling that existed between them, carried his own considerable damage. The kind of damage that when 2 people are both wounded in foundational ways creates not healing, but a collision. She has said, in the careful and considered language of someone who has spent years thinking about what is fair to say publicly about another human being, that she loved him. She has also made clear that the relationship was not good for her, that it reinforced certain patterns, the reaching for approval, the shrinking of self in the presence of a dominant personality, the old learned accommodation of someone who needs something from you in a way that costs you more than you should have to pay. Burt Reynolds died in 2018, the same year Sally published her memoir. She did not use his death as an occasion for public statement. She had already said in those pages what there was to say about what they were to each other. The grief, if she felt it, was the quiet kind, the kind that does not perform. And running beneath all of it, never fully resolved, never fully quiet, the childhood she was still, even in her 50s and 60s, still sorting through. Still trying to understand. Still trying to place in some framework that would allow her to stop blaming herself for surviving it the way she did. Because that is what no one tells you about the children who are harmed in the way Sally was harmed. The damage is not primarily in the memory of the event. The damage is in the conclusion the child draws about their own value. The lesson installed without consent at the deepest level of the operating system. That you are not worth protecting. That harm is something you absorb. That love is something you earn by disappearing into whatever shape the other person requires. Sally Field spent decades inside that lesson. She performed her way through it. She mothered through it. She loved through it. She accepted awards through it. And she stood at podiums telling audiences that they liked her, they really liked her, in a moment the world received as charming, and that was in fact the raw, unguarded truth of a woman for whom approval had always felt like oxygen, and its absence like slow suffocation. But she was not confessing insecurity in that moment. She was confessing decades. Now let us talk about the career itself, because to understand what Sally built you have to understand what she was building against. The 1970s arrived and found her at a crossroads that the industry had designed with particular cruelty for women who refused to remain decorative. Gidget was behind her. The Flying Nun was behind her. The cheerful, uncomplicated brightness that had made her famous was beginning to feel to the people who controlled the opportunities like the full perimeter of what she could offer. She was being pigeonholed with the casual violence that the entertainment industry reserves for women whose value has been decided too early and too narrowly. She fought it. Not loudly. Not with the kind of public rebellion that generates headlines and then generates consequences. She fought it the way she had always fought the hardest things. From the inside, quietly, with an almost terrifying commitment to the work itself. She enrolled in the actor's studio. She studied with Lee Strasberg. She submitted herself to the most rigorous training available in American theater and film. Not because she needed external validation of her talent, though the industry skepticism had certainly earned its share of doubt, but because she understood instinctively that the only way through the ceiling above her was to become so undeniably, technically, irrefutably good that dismissal would require a level of dishonesty even Hollywood could not sustain. And then came Sybil. In 1976, Sally Field took on one of the most demanding roles in the history of American television. A woman living with a condition that at the time had almost no cultural vocabulary and even less public understanding. Sybil Dorsett was not a character who could be played from the surface. She required something far more terrifying. Full surrender to psychological complexity. A full inhabitation of states that most actors would have approached from a careful protective distance. Sally did not approach from a distance. She won the Emmy Award. Not once, twice. For Outstanding Lead Actress in what remains one of the most discussed performances in the medium's history. The industry that had spent a decade filing her under light comedy was forced, publicly and without the option of quiet revision, to reckon with what it had been underestimating. But it was what came 3 years later that would define her legacy in ways that still resonate today. Norma Ray. The year was 1979. The director was Martin Ritt. The character was a cotton mill worker in a small southern town. A woman of limited formal education and unlimited moral courage who stands up against conditions that the powerful have decided the powerless should simply accept. A woman who lifts a handwritten sign above her head in the middle of a factory floor, and in doing so stops time. To watch Sally Field in Norma Ray is to watch something that transcends performance and becomes, in the truest sense, witness. She is not playing a working-class woman. She is not illustrating one. She is occupying the full interior of a human being whose dignity has been underestimated by everyone around her. And she is doing it with the complete, unguarded presence of someone who knows from the inside exactly what it feels like to be underestimated, to be looked past, to be assigned a value by people who have never paused long enough to actually see you. She won the Academy Award. She stood at that podium in 1980 and received it with a composure that belied everything the journey had cost. She thanked the people she was supposed to thank. She was gracious and warm and precisely as generous in that moment as she had always been in every moment. And then she returned home to the private landscape of a life that the award did not simplify and the applause did not heal. Because that is the part the industry never narrates. The part after the podium. The part where the woman who has just been told by her peers that she is the best in the world at what she does returns to a life in which the wound that drove her to that level of excellence is still exactly where she left it. Undisturbed by the trophy. Unimpressed by the reviews. Still there. Still asking the same question it had always asked. Are you worth it? 5 years later, in 1984, she answered that question from a different stage. Places in the Heart. A Depression-era widow in Waxahachie, Texas. A woman named Edna Spaulding who is left without warning and without preparation to hold together a farm, a family, and a life that a single moment of random violence has fundamentally unmade. A woman who has no reason to believe she can do what is required of her, and no choice but to do it anyway. The parallels were not accidental. They never were with Sally. The characters she chose, or perhaps more accurately the characters that chose her, were consistently women operating at the outer limit of what a person can endure and still remain recognizable to themselves. Women who carry damage without being defined by it. Women who love imperfectly and fiercely. Women who survive not because they are exceptional in any abstract mythological sense, but because they refuse, in the very specific and unglamorous way of real human beings, to stop. She won her second Academy Award. And this time at the podium something different happened. You like me. You really like me. The world laughed affectionately. The clip circulated for decades, held up sometimes tenderly and sometimes unkindly as the emblem of an endearing earnestness. An actress so nakedly hungry for approval that she said the quiet part out loud in front of the entire industry. What the laughter missed was the depth of what she was actually saying. This was not a woman who had momentarily forgotten her composure. This was a woman for whom the need to be liked, to be seen, to be valued, to be told explicitly that her presence in the room was wanted, was not a charming quirk, but a lifelong ache with very specific origins. The little girl whose safety had depended on reading the emotional temperature of dangerous rooms. The teenager who had learned that warmth was a currency she could spend to purchase something resembling security. The young actress who had spent a decade being told in the polite language of professional dismissal that she was not quite enough. She was not performing gratitude in that moment. She was releasing 60 years of the opposite. The career that followed those 2 Oscars continued at a level that most actors would describe as a summit, and that Sally treated, characteristically, as simply the next portion of the work to be done. Steel Magnolias arrived in 1989 and gave her MLYNN Eatonton, the role that a specific generation will name without hesitation as the one that broke them open. The scene in the cemetery. The grief that erupts not in the soft photogenic way of cinematic mourning, but in the raw, almost violent way of actual loss. The kind that has no interest in being witnessed gracefully and cannot be contained within the frame of what is socially acceptable. It was not acting. It was excavation. And then 5 years later, Forrest Gump. A role that required almost none of the technical complexity of Norma Ray or Sybil, and that reached somehow an even wider audience. Because what Sally brought to Mrs. Gump was not technique. It was something quieter, and in some ways more difficult. Pure unconditional maternal love. The absolute conviction that a child is worthy of everything. Of protection. Of encouragement. Of the full, fierce dedication of the person responsible for them. She played it from a place that had no distance in it whatsoever. Life is like a box of chocolates. The line became a cultural touchstone. What it carried in her delivery was something the writers could not have fully anticipated. The weight of a woman who understood from the inside what it meant to have that kind of love withheld. Who knew the precise dimensions of its absence. Who could offer it on screen with such completeness because she had spent her entire life understanding what it meant to need it and not receive it. Throughout these decades of professional triumph, the private architecture of her life was being tested in ways the camera never fully captured. The end of her second marriage in 1994 left her at 47 as a single mother to 3 sons, navigating the specific exhaustion of a woman who gives everything in public and must somehow find more to give when the cameras are gone. The boys were her center, her constancy, the place where she was not performing anything, not building anything, not proving anything, just present, imperfectly and fiercely in the way that mattered most. She has spoken about motherhood with the particular gratitude of someone who understands at a level that cannot be fully articulated how much the experience gave her. Not just love, though that abundantly, but evidence. Evidence that she was capable of creating something safe. That the cycle did not have to continue. That whatever had been done to her in a California house decades before did not have the final word on what kind of love she was capable of offering. Her sons were proof that she had not become the damage. And then in 2005, the body delivered its own reckoning. She was 58 years old when she was diagnosed with osteoporosis. For most public figures, this would be disclosed in a press release and quietly managed in private. Sally did something different. She became an advocate. She spoke about the diagnosis publicly. She used her platform to address bone health, to encourage women to take their physical vulnerability seriously, to refuse the cultural instruction that aging women should minimize their medical realities in order to remain acceptable. It was consistent with everything she had always been. Someone who transforms personal difficulty into public usefulness. Who takes the thing that happened to her and finds a way to make it matter for someone else. But beneath the advocacy was a woman confronting in a new and visceral way the fragility of the body she had spent decades inside. The body that had carried all of it. The childhood, the marriages, the performances, the grief, the love, the work. The body that had never been treated as something worth protecting. She protected it now, carefully, methodically, with the same fierce attention she had always brought to the things that mattered most. And then on the 6th of November 2011, on her 65th birthday, her mother died. There is almost no way to write about that timing that does not feel like a reach toward the dramatic. And yet it happened. The woman who had given Sally life, and who had also in the most foundational way failed to protect it, left the world on the exact day Sally had entered it 65 years before. The grief was not simple. It could not be. Because grief for a parent who has harmed you or failed to protect you from harm carries within it a complexity that clean mourning does not have to navigate. You are grieving the person who was there. You are also grieving the person who should have been there and wasn't. You are grieving the love that existed alongside the failure. Because the love did exist. Complicated and real and insufficient and profound all at once. Sally had spent years in therapy by that point. Years working through what her childhood had cost her, what it had built in her, what it had taken from her that she was still, even in her 60s, in the process of reclaiming. The death of her mother did not resolve any of that, but it changed the shape of it. It closed a door that had always on some level remained slightly open. The door through which a child waits, even in the body of an aging woman, for the acknowledgement that never quite arrives in the form you needed it to take. Margaret was gone, and with her went the last possibility of the conversation that perhaps neither of them had ever fully known how to have. Sally did not retreat. She wrote. 7 years of writing. 7 years of returning to the page, and then leaving it. Of finding the language, and then losing it. Of getting close enough to the truth to feel its heat, and then stepping back because the heat was simply too much. 7 years of a process that her editor would later describe as one of the most committed and painful acts of literary courage she had ever witnessed in her professional life. In 2018, In Pieces arrived. It was received broadly as an act of bravery. A disclosure. A memoir about surviving childhood sexual abuse. About the complexity of loving a mother who failed you. About the lifelong work of understanding how early damage shapes the architecture of adult life. The reviews were respectful. The interviews were conducted with care. What was perhaps underappreciated in the noise of the reception was the specific nature of the courage involved. Sally Field was 71 years old when that book was published. She had spent more than 6 decades carrying a truth that the world did not know. She had built an entire career, a legendary 2-Oscar, industry-defining career, while holding this story in the part of herself that the cameras never reached. And she had then sat down in her late 60s and early 70s and written it out. Not to perform bravery. Not for the publicity cycle. But because the silence had finally cost more than the telling. Because she was done protecting everyone else. Because she had earned at last the right to take up the full space of her own truth. The world received the book. But the cost of writing it, the 7 years of excavation, the reopening of wounds that had been managed but never fully closed, the specific grief of putting into permanent words what had been done to her by someone her mother had chosen and trusted, that cost remained hers alone. As it always had been. At 79, Sally Field wakes up every morning in a body that remembers everything. The osteoporosis that arrived in 2005 has not retreated. It has simply been negotiated with carefully daily, with the particular discipline of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning that the things which threaten to diminish you require not surrender but management. Physical therapy, deliberate movement, the constant unglamorous attention to a skeleton that carries in its very molecular structure the record of decades of stress absorbed without adequate support. The body keeps the score. It always does. And yet the woman inside that body has arrived, by most accounts, by the evidence of her interviews and her choices and her public presence in these most recent years, at something her earlier self would not have fully recognized. Not peace exactly. Peace implies the absence of struggle, and struggle has never fully left her. But something adjacent to peace. Something that might be called, with appropriate care, acceptance. She lives in Los Angeles. Her 3 sons, Peter, Eli, and Samuel, are grown men now with their own lives and their own complicated inheritances from a mother who loved them with everything she had and who was herself still in the process of being repaired while she was doing the raising. She speaks about them with the particular tenderness of a woman who understands that motherhood was not only something she gave, but something that gave back. Evidence, repeated and renewable, that she was capable of love that did not harm. That the cycle she had been born into did not have to be the cycle she passed forward. Her grandchildren have arrived, and with them a quality of presence that the younger Sally, the one running through decades of work and pain and proving, rarely had available to her. The ability to simply be in a room with someone small and new and uncomplicated in their need for warmth. And to offer that warmth without the undertow of everything it once cost her to give it. She has spoken in recent years about aging with a frankness that the industry still finds faintly surprising in women, though it should not. She does not perform youth. She does not reach for the kind of defiant visibility that some public figures deploy as armor against the awareness of time passing. She is 79 years old. The years are visible. The miles are visible. And she has arrived, it seems, at the decision that visibility is not the same as vulnerability. That allowing herself to be seen accurately is in fact the final form of the courage she has been practicing her entire life. Because that is what the arc of Sally's story ultimately describes. Not a trajectory from obscurity to fame. Not a narrative of wounds overcome and legacy secured. Something more honest and more difficult than either of those framings. A lifelong education in the difference between being seen and being known. Between performing survival and actually surviving. Between the applause that fills a room and the quiet that remains when the room empties. And learning, finally, to find that quiet habitable rather than terrifying. She has said, in the language of a woman who has earned the right to plain speech, that writing in pieces changed her. Not in the way that people sometimes describe transformation, sudden and complete, the before and after divided by a clean line, but in the slower, more trustworthy way. The way that happens when you finally stop carrying something in the dark and bring it into a light you chose on your own terms at a moment you controlled. The weight does not disappear, but it shifts. It becomes somehow more yours. Less a thing being done to you, and more a thing you have claimed and named and placed deliberately in the record. The little girl in that California house was not able to choose any of it. The woman at 79 chose all of this. That distinction is not small. It is in fact everything. And so what remains when you have stripped away the awards and the credits and the decades of performances that made generations of strangers feel understood? What is the actual legacy of Sally Field? Not the cultural artifact, but the human being. It is this. A woman who was handed damage at an age when she had no tools to refuse it, and who spent the entirety of the life that followed deciding, over and over and over, in ways large and invisible, and everything in between, that the damage would not be the last word. Who built a career from the raw material of her own interior. Who loved her children with the fierce, deliberate intention of someone who knew exactly what the absence of that love produced. Who sat down in her 70s and wrote the truth. Not for applause. Not for the publicity cycle. Not for the clean resolution that memoirs are sometimes mistaken for providing. But because silence in the end had cost more than she was willing to keep paying. She spent 60 years making the world feel safe. And then at last she turned that same attention, careful and fierce and unflinching, toward herself. That is not a small thing. In a culture that asks women, and particularly women who have been harmed, to absorb quietly and perform gracefully and never demand more space than they have been assigned, choosing to tell the full truth of your own life is an act of profound and lasting courage. It does not require a podium. It does not require an audience. It requires only the willingness to believe, after everything, that your story, the real one, not the curated one, is worth the telling. Sally Field believed it at 71 when she published the book. She believes it still. And if her story reached something in you today, if something in these words landed in a place you recognize, share this with someone who is carrying something heavy. Because these stories only matter fully when they travel. When they find the person who needed to hear them at exactly the moment they were told. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you need it most. Because behind every legend there is a human being who simply refused to stop. And that of all the things worth remembering is the one that endures.